This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.
With the imminent release of Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, it is the first time in about a decade that Metal Gear is being reinterpreted without its creator present. Hideo Kojima may be considered one of the auteurs in games industry, but his fingerprints can also be seen as blemishes on his projects. Kojima's projects aren't just Metal Gear games, but also a Hideo Kojima game. Metal Gear as a series has often seen remakes without the involvement of Hideo Kojima. So I wanted to take a critical look back at these often overlooked moments in the series. How do others reinterpret his work and either expand, elaborate, or even perhaps edit the world that he so carefully crafted during his tenure at Konami? What is Metal Gear without Kojima? And what might this tell us about the future of the franchise? And yes, even if you haven't played these games, this might be a fun look back at the series through a slightly different lens than you may have seen before. I will spare you the extensive history of the series, but the original Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake were developed for the MSX, a Japanese home computer, featuring pretty decent stealth gameplay for the time, where enemies were able to spot the player and trigger an alarm. It was quite a simple story about a mobile nuclear tank called Metal Gear, operated by a terrorist leader known as Big Boss. It became the groundwork for when the franchise rebooted itself as Metal Gear Solid in 1998 for the original PlayStation. But unbeknownst to him, Konami decided to make a port of the original Metal Gear to the Famicom and the NES. Reducing the advanced graphics and programming capabilities of the MSX to an 8-bit home console was no small feat. But the end result was something that wasn't a particularly well done translation of the source material. It lacked several features, including the stealth gameplay and even the final boss, the titular Metal Gear. Kojima has said in interviews that he found the game to be too challenging. Quote, "In the Famicom version, the dogs just come after you and you get killed. It was too difficult to get into the fortress." In fact, the game ends with an escape sequence after having to blow up the main computer, rather than you fighting the Metal Gear robot. Big Boss is defeated, leaving the door open for Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. But that game never came to other systems than the MSX until decades later. So you might be wondering why bring up Metal Gear on NES specifically if it is just a port. Konami did a lot of porting for their arcade titles and MSX software to the Famicom, because Metal Gear on NES formed the baseline for Metal Gear Snake's Revenge. This title is probably the first non-canonical event in the Metal Gear series, as it was developed without Kojima's involvement and even his knowledge. Structurally, it is the same as Metal Gear for NES, but resembling more of an action game, with some stealth elements. On Secret Mission 747, this Snake is sent to fight terrorists that may have gotten their hands on another Metal Gear machine. The story might even be more simple than that of the original Metal Gear, with Big Boss somehow returning as a cyborg, and the Metal Gear finally making an appearance itself, albeit only to be defeated at a distance by firing guided missiles at it. When Kojima was active at Konami, he always took significant care in tying all the loose ends, for better or worse, in the Metal Gear universe. Metal Gear Snake's Revenge, given the wild retcons that later games in the series would bring to the original Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 on MSX, has never been acknowledged. Fans have speculated that you might be able to stretch that the Big Boss you defeat in this game can technically exist, but even for Kojima brain lore, that might be really overdoing it. What I find more interesting looking at Snake's Revenge is the way in which the character is portrayed and shown. While we don't see that much of Solid Snake in the MSX games, through its box art and manual text, he is portrayed as an infiltration spy agent. While clearly inspired by action movies from the 70s and early 80s, his design is more slender and gruff compared to that of Schwarzenegger and Stallone, two of the most recognizable action stars of those decades. It gives off the impression that while Solid Snake is a trained soldier and a combat expert, he doesn't have muscles for the sake of showing off. So when we put this design next to Snake's Revenge, you can clearly see how another creator reinterprets Kojima's work. Snake here isn't a Black Ops spy, but rather an almost generic muscled military man wielding two guns and dressed in a full action movie setup, resembling more Rambo than Bond. It seems that Konami might have been more interested in setting up Metal Gear as a military-themed action game, perhaps a top-down version of their more popular Contra series in the West. Of course, Metal Gear back then wasn't quite a series yet in the West, and more of a cult classic for those in Japan and the few European countries where the MSX was available. but it would take nearly a decade for Metal Gear to resurface. So it's a decade later, 3 years after the release of Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid has cemented itself as a modern classic, blending stealth gameplay with science fiction espionage story and a cast of very lovable characters. While the majority of players had never experienced a game in the Metal Gear series, Solid Snake and Kojima had the eyes of gamers everywhere fixed upon them. But Metal Gear Solid also had a particularly challenging development, being a fully 3D action game, with not just an hours-long script with a large cast of voice actors, but also using several groundbreaking techniques in order to realize its world. Konami was probably feeling like they were sitting on top of a gold mine, and while an expanded edition that included 300 VR missions was released a year later, development on Metal Gear Solid 2 proved to be just as notorious, if not more so, than the original. So when Konami Europe requested a new game to be developed for the Game Boy and later the Game Boy Color, Kojima remained focused on Metal Gear Solid 2, while Shinto Nojiri, a Konami veteran but first-time director, went to work on Metal Gear Solid Ghost Babel. Right from the start, you can see that Metal Gear Solid has become a new baseline for the Metal Gear series. A lengthy cutscene with a mission briefing, using portraits for the characters, and in particular the tone and setting immediately remind you of Metal Gear Solid. Introducing military groups, countries with ongoing wars, and highlighting the extended support group for Solid Snake instantly makes the game feel like a Metal Gear game as we recognize it after 1998. Funnily enough, the gameplay and story harken back to the events of the original Metal Gear, perhaps as a way to make sure that newcomers would be introduced to the events of the original two MSX titles, which are only brought up in references in Metal Gear Solid. Though, funnily enough, Ghost Babel lives in a sort of in-between state in context of the larger series. Its events are referenced occasionally through Easter eggs in Metal Gear Solid 4 and 5, but canonically, they aren't a part of the main Metal Gear Solid timeline. This seems to have more to do with Kojima's pride than a repeat of Metal Gear Solid 2 Snake's Revenge, because Ghost Babel is really good. Gameplay-wise, it managed to combine both the top view gameplay from Metal Gear 1 and 2 on the MSX, but with some stealth elements and gameplay tweaks from Metal Gear Solid. The inventory system is a lot more manageable. You can finally crawl and sidle against walls to stay out of your enemy's sights, and it captures the feeling of a Metal Gear game incredibly well. Using adapted designs from Metal Gear Solid makes the sprites very well suited for this reframe perspective. Even the radar system and the inventory management fits on the main screen of the Game Boy Color very well. What we see is a direction that Metal Gear Solid could have taken as a broader series. While the series is now mostly synonymous with PlayStation systems, Ghost Babel shows how there could have been a distinct counterpart on Game Boy or even Game Boy Advance as a Subseries. Without Kojima at the helm, the story at times even feels less bloated. While early Kojima projects had a lot more focus than Metal Gear Solid 4, 5 or even his most recent work in Death Stranding, the man has always had a tendency to weave multiple strains of thought together, often resulting in a more convoluted way of storytelling that wants to say everything at once. I'm looking at you, Metal Gear Solid 2. While playing the game, I got the feeling that Nojiri was happy with Kojima's input, but that it doesn't go on and on about needless side characters. It cuts a lot of bullshit, which results in a far more focused game. Frankly, it's a pity that Ghost Babel often gets overlooked in the larger Metal Gear discourse, because I think that with Kojima as a supervisor, letting others play around in the toy box enriches the world and characters in a way that he often feels reluctant to in his later games. Speaking of letting others play around in his toy box, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. At first glance, Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes is the type of high-end remake that is all too common these days. Using the design choices from Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, the game is much more refined in its gameplay. Kojima requested specifically that Silicon Knights, mostly known for Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem on the GameCube 2 years earlier, would take up development of this remake, as he was working on the development of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, making it the first non-Konami studio working on a Metal Gear project. The end result is almost more interesting as a historical artifact of the time, because the game looks stunning, especially when comparing it to the PlayStation original. Facial animations, proper first-person shooting mechanics, and re-recorded dialogues almost makes it feel like a definitive version of Metal Gear Solid. And yet, something feels off. Because we're not looking at Kojima reinterpreting his own work, but rather someone else looking at what made Metal Gear Solid so iconic only 6 years after its original release. What is often talked about are the redone cutscenes, which are vastly different from the original. At first I figured this was the original intention behind the scene, but due to the limitations of the PlayStation 1, they weren't able to realize it at the time. However, as the cutscene changes go on to be more elaborate, it turns into more of a distraction. I do not think that a newcomer would be too bothered by these, but Solid Snakes moves almost as much as a ninja, like Grey Fox does. Presumably inspired by The Matrix and its sequel, the game is way more action focused in its presentation. Solid Snake flies through the air dodging bullets, Grey Fox throws his sword in slow motion, and it feels much more akin to an action film rather than the original spy thriller. I do think it helps flesh out a few of the side characters a bit more, in part because of the better facial animations. What makes it particularly surprising is that the redone cutscenes were not done because of Silicon Knights, but rather the man himself, Hideo Kojima. It was him once again, he's always doing this. He worked with Japanese director Ryohei Kitamura, best known for directing Japanese action films like Godzilla Final Wars, Versus, and Azumi, and asked him to rework the Twin Snakes action cutscenes to his particular style. Kitamura was a big fan of Kojima's games, and Kojima has stated in an interview that he wanted Kitamura to make his own versions of the cutscenes to respect his directorial style. This is what contributes to Twin Snakes' presentation feeling like a Frankenstein's monster at times. Characters doing impossible feats in cutscenes, but then returning to the limited gameplay gives off a tonal whiplash. While it is definitely interesting that Kojima let a fan work on his original creation, it feels at times like a disservice to the ambition of the project and the strengths of the original game. Now, granted, a lot of this fades away when looking at the game from the gameplay perspective. Removed from the PlayStation 1, it plays like a dream, with fluent movement and the gameplay that made the opening prologue for Metal Gear Solid 2 so renowned back in 2001. Answering codec calls with the start button and the A button feels a bit cramped, and that shooting in first person with a GameCube controller always takes some getting used to. More interesting is that with the introduction of proper first person aiming, the game's boss battles like Revolver Ocelot and Sniper Wolf become a lot easier. No longer restricted with the cramped grip and blocky polygons on the PS1, it shows that reusing these boss battles exactly as they were becomes a bit of a flaw for a modern remake. Twin Snakes balances on a knife's edge at times, stuck between not being able to fully commit to a faithful remake and being remade, highlighting its structural limitations from back in the day. It's a shame that the game has become rare and hard to come by, because as an analytical subject, it is super interesting within the larger context of Metal Gear Solid. That analysis is unfortunately beyond the scope of this piece, but given that another Metal Gear Solid game has gotten the extensive remake treatment with Metal Gear Solid Delta, I am curious to see if they'll hold back on similar additions for a project that is perhaps even more beloved than the original Metal Gear Solid. You'll never guess this, but Hideo Kojima was working on a mainline Metal Gear game while making other Metal Gear games. Truth be told, Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater 3D is probably mostly noteworthy for being a portable version of Metal Gear Solid 3 for the Nintendo 3DS. There's a couple of unique features, like the game supporting not just the 3DS Circle Pad Pro accessory, meaning you can actually have two sticks to walk and aim, but did you know you could also take photos of your surroundings and use them as camouflage for Naked Snake? I mean, that is if you can stand the substantially lower frame rate of the game, which doesn't bode well for either being played on the original 3DS or the new 3DS systems. Unlike the Twin Snakes, however, this game is about as faithful a port as it can be. While it was rebuilt from the ground up, boasting higher quality character models than the original PlayStation 2 release, there are no changes in the script, cutscenes, or voice work. The original voice lines by the performers were reused and nearly unaltered, here and there replacing tutorials for specific PlayStation buttons with generic terms like action button. Indeed, it seems that either this version wasn't worth the effort to go back to and change things, though funnily enough it came out about as long after Metal Gear Solid 3 as Twin Snakes did for Metal Gear Solid. Or perhaps Kojima was pleased enough with the outcome of Metal Gear Solid 3 that he didn't feel the need to add things in as a supervisor. So the game is about as straight a port as one can expect. This would become the trend for Metal Gear Solid re-releases between 2012 and 2023. The Metal Gear Solid HD collection packed Metal Gear Solid 2, 3 and Peace Walker, a port of a PSP game together, while the PlayStation 3 got the exclusive Metal Gear Solid Legacy Collection, which added Metal Gear Solid 1, Metal Gear Solid 4, and some additional bonus materials. Finally, in 2023, the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection, Volume 1, would bring almost all of the Metal Gear games up till Peace Walker to all major systems. Funnily enough, this also marked the return of both Metal Gear and Snake's Revenge on NES, which were included in the package. Now, this all happened after Hideo Kojima left Konami and began his own studio called Kojima Productions, where he developed Death Stranding and Death Stranding 2 on the Beach. It seems that Konami was cautious, in part after the divisive reception of Metal Gear Survive back in 2018, but is now fully committed to getting as much out of Metal Gear as possible without necessarily promising a new entry without Kojima's involvement. Straight up ports seemed like the norm until Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater. It was rumored for years that Konami was eyeing a remake of perhaps its most lauded Metal Gear Solid game. Snake Eater isn't just a great game, it is also a good entry point for a lot of people to get to know and understand the world of Metal Gear Solid. It can stand alone in the larger context of the series, due to it being presented as more of a prequel rather than tying into the extensive lore and world presented through the games. So Metal Gear Solid Delta, Snake Eater, wasn't really a surprise to see announced. Konami has over the last few years brought back quite a number of their games through remasters, remakes and spiritual sequels. The elephant in the room here is obvious. Would it follow the path of the Twin Snakes and reinterpret the work of Kojima without his involvement? Or would it be more akin to yet another port of Metal Gear Solid 3 with a fresh coat of paint for current gen systems? Well, turns out that Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater is possibly the most accurate remaster or remake one could ask for. All the cutscenes have been perfectly recreated, except for all the credits having a little original tag placed in front of them for the original designers. The gameplay feels slick and modern, on par with current gen action games. There's some gameplay tweaks and additions from later Metal Gear games, like Snake being able to aim and shoot when laying down in his back, and even something like crouching and shooting at the same time, which was available in Metal Gear Solid 3D through Metal Gear Solid 4 but not in the original Metal Gear Solid 3, and my brain just went numb. The biggest surprise to me was that Cynthia Harrell has re-recorded the iconic opening song Snake Eater with fully reworked cutscenes. What a thrill. Presenting it less as the Bond-esque feeling the original went for, and more of a love letter to Metal Gear Solid 3 on the whole. Patterns of planes, camouflages and snakes have been replaced with in-game cutscenes from Metal Gear Solid Delta, the game you're about to play. Snake Eater is an all-timer, but I do believe that this particular version feels a bit unnecessary. Perhaps it was more of a rights issue than a creative wish on the developer's part, but Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater remains one of the all-time greats. Its gameplay feels distinct from other entries in the series, and while holding true to the stealth gameplay and immersion the series is known for. Delta is a very fine remaster, but it did make me question why go through all this effort and try not to explore new additions. Perhaps its online component, a sort of hide-and-seek mode called Fox Hunt, which brings to mind online multiplayer modes like in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood from 2009, is engaging enough to stand on its own. Regardless, if this is your first time playing Snake Eater or returning to its world and characters, it's almost like you remember it being, but with a nicer sheen. Sometimes that might just be enough. In conclusion, looking back at the history of Metal Gear remakes, it is surprising to see how Konami turned from wanting to broadly expand the series to being very hesitant and delicate about touching this particular franchise. Perhaps dipping their toe in with Delta gives Konami the courage to keep pursuing Metal Gear as a series without its original creator being involved. I know that many are eagerly anticipating the second volume of the Metal Gear Solid Master Collection, hoping that some of the more notorious games like Portable Ops, Peace Walker, and especially Metal Gear Solid 4 will finally make it to other systems. If Konami's current track record is anything to go by, it seems they are willing to introduce Metal Gear to a new generation with care and attention, walking that tightrope between not wanting to upset fans and lowering the barrier of entry to newcomers. Delta is perhaps more of an important stepping stone than just seeing Snake return on current gen hardware. How the road will wind from here, we'll have to find out. But much like a bipedal nuclear missile launcher, I'm sure we haven't seen the last of Snake quite yet.
This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.